Darkstalkers 3. Also known as Vampire Savior in Japan, the horror-themed fighting game was released in 1997 by Capcom, during a period where the fighting game industry was experimenting with a variety of new titles and ideas. And while there are so many fighting games from this period that you could talk about, I have to say that Darkstalkers 3 is one of my favorites, and for good reason. Outside the very solid gameplay, the stages in the series have so many small details brimming with creative, quirky energy. I mean, just look at the Aburaya stage. Look at this little guy, how can you not love him? Plus, all of the characters' animations are just so fun and goofy. This particular frame of Morgan being attacked is absolutely hilarious to me. But in today's video, I don't actually want to talk about Morgan, who has been featured in many different crossover titles and still continues to be promoted by Capcom, despite the fact that a new Darkstalkers game hasn't come out in almost 25 years, not including re-releases. Instead, I want to talk about one of my favorites and mains in Darkstalkers 3, Hsien-ko, also known as Lele in the Japanese version. When you first look at Hsien-ko, it may not be immediately obvious what she's supposed to be based off of if you live in a more Western culture like me. When you look at the cast at a glance, you can tell that Dimitri is a vampire and that John Talbane is a werewolf, for example, because these are figures commonly depicted in Western media. But Hsien-ko is often a mystery to new players. She's just some blue zombie girl with abnormally long sleeves. But in fact, Hsien-ko is not a zombie. She is a jiangshi, or a Chinese hopping vampire. In Chinese mythology, jiangshi are reanimated corpses whose bodies have stiffened because of rigor mortis, hence their short hops as they move. They're typically depicted with pale skin and are usually wearing the uniform of a Qing dynasty official, along with a spelled paper talisman sometimes attached to their hat. Jiangshi are supposedly born when a person's soul fails to leave their corpse because they didn't die properly for whatever reason, the person committed suicide, or just wanting to be a troublemaker after death. However, this was not the case for Hsien-ko, who became a jiangshi under very different circumstances. In Darkstalkers lore, she sacrifices her humanity in order to free her mother's soul from the darkness, who was killed in an attack on their family's village. Her mother died trying to protect Hsien-ko and her sisters from the Darkstalkers, a group of supernatural beings and the namesake of the series. It's a whole complicated plot that I'm not going to get into here since we're not here to talk about the characters, but rather the stages. So let's get right into it. Hsien-ko's stage in Darkstalkers 3 is called Vanity Paradise, which I personally believe is likely a depiction of Chinese heaven, or Tiangong. A personal theory of mine is that this stage may be a representation of Hsien-ko's mother's afterlife. The entire stage is enveloped in a rich yellowish-orange tone, likely due to the light of the rising or setting sun behind the boat. Starting from the right side of the foreground, we see some rocks, part of a stone wall, and some shrubs and flowers. There's also a pink flowering tree where a woman surrounded by butterflies is just hanging out. She's likely a female deity, or maybe a Chinese Fei Tian, which is a female spirit of the clouds and waters in Hinduism and Buddhist culture. Behind the tree, you can also see some mountains off in the distance, which have this really pretty gradient coloring. To the left, there's also another woman standing in front of a pier. Behind her is a pavilion on top of a rock formation in the middle of some sort of lake or ocean. Here, I really like the reflection of the pavilion on the water and the smooth motion of the currents. There's also another woman on a Chinese sailboat, or cao, to the left of the pier, which bobs up and down with the tide. There are also some broken stones besides the boat, which lead to a pathway lined by lanterns, which then leads upwards towards the background. The top of the path is obscured by the sail of the boat, but presumably connects with the pavilion in the background. Continuing to the left, we can also see a pillar on the left side of the stage, which is engraved with words written in Japanese kanji. Alright, now time for a mini history lesson. For a bit of linguistic context, way back in the day, Chinese characters called Hanzi made their way overseas to Japan, eventually becoming the Japanese kanji that you see today. However, along the way, the meaning, pronunciation, and appearance of those Chinese words changed over time. In modern-day Japanese and Chinese, the pronunciation of these characters are completely different. However, the writing systems have not diverged as much as the spoken language, to the point where most Chinese people can read some Japanese kanji and vice versa, though they can't understand each other verbally. There's a ton of other differences as well, like Japan having 2 additional writing systems, for example, but this is all to say that since I'm trying to roughly translate Japanese kanji, which I'm not so familiar with, into Chinese characters, which I can read, and then those characters into English, I just want to caveat that there are definitely some things that could be missing in translation here. Okay, so with that out of the way, back to the actual words. As far as I can tell, the kanji on the pillar roughly translates into the Chinese words qi, dui, something I can't make out, and then lei. The first word qi means air, and the last word lei means thunder. The second word dui has a variety of meanings that really depend on context. It could mean correct, opposite, or pair, just to name a few possibilities. As for the third word, I'm really not sure what this is just because of how fuzzy the writing is. I even asked my parents, who have a much better grasp on Chinese than I do, but no dice. What I can tell though is that the left side of the character, called a radical, is typically associated with words that have to do with water. So, an educated guess is that this character has something to do with water, but I can't really say for sure. If any of you happen to have an up-resed version of this scene or happen to know what this character is, please let me know. So, the third character aside, when you put the other 3 characters together in a phrase, the meaning here really doesn't make sense either. As far as I can tell, it's just a bunch of words kind of shoved together. But again, I might be missing something here, so if you happen to know what this phrase is supposed to translate to, please let me know. The song for the stage is also called Vanity Paradise, or Hsien-ko's theme, and it starts off very peacefully. We first hear the sound of water, bells, percussion, and some plucky electronic notes, which I suspect is trying to mimic the sound of a Chinese erhu, which is a 2-string instrument. Then, in really quick succession, the electronic beat hits, the gong comes in, and the melody really picks up and is carried by the electronic synthesizer, which I think is likely trying to mimic the sound of a Chinese flute or dizi. Overall, this song gives me a very upbeat, kind of plucky impression, which I think fits well with Hsien-ko's personality. As a side note, there's also a really cool remix of this song in the Darkstalkers Resurrection main menu of all places, and for some reason this isn't in the actual game itself. This version is largely the same as the previous one, but with some added percussion and some actual instruments in the melody instead of just being carried by the synthesizer. Personally, I do like this version of the song slightly more than the original, just because the song is a little more complex and bumpin' than the original, but both sound great. Also in the original release of Darkstalkers 3, there is an alternative blue tone version of this stage, with the huge sun replaced by the moon. The stage almost looks like it could be during the day because it's very bright and colorful, but with the moon, it obviously takes place at night. As far as I could tell, this is almost the exact same stage, but just colored differently. Vampire Savior 2, the updated version of Darkstalkers 3 only released in Japan, features only the blue version and not the yellowish/orange version. I slightly prefer the blue paletted version over the yellowish-orange one, since I think the blue tones complement the pink of the tree and the pink of the clothing of the woman more, but that's just a personal preference. It's crazy to me how a simple palette swap can just change the mood of an entire stage, but both are great. Interestingly enough, when I was doing research for this stage, while looking at the concept art for this stage in the Darkstalkers official complete works book, you can actually see that the art for all of the other stages, such as the Deserted Chateau or the Tower of Arrogance, are very detailed and done in this almost colored pencil-like drawing. But looking at the style of the Vanity Paradise concept art, it's clear that this was done in a more calligraphy-like style with paint-like strokes, and I just really appreciate the extra detail and thought that went into creating this image. Hsien-ko is a character that I love playing as, not only for her interesting backstory, creation, and stage, but also because she's just an upbeat goofball who's a ton of fun to play. Hopefully, I was able to shed some light for you all in today's video, as well as convince you that you need to go online and let Capcom know that they need to make another Darkstalkers game. Joking, but not joking. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this shorter video. I also just wanted to thank you all for all of the support. It's honestly been a little overwhelming since I expected maybe a few of my friends to watch this. So, shameless plug is that I also have an Instagram and Twitter. My Instagram stuff is mostly my cosplay stuff, and on Twitter I just kind of ramble like a madwoman, both which will be linked in the description. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, please like, rate, and subscribe, and I'll see y'all in the next one.